when I'm talking about stroke, what am I talking about tonight? Stroke's a term that we as neurologists use to describe a vascular brain injury, an injury to the brain that is caused by vascular damage, whether that's the blood vessels in the brain being blocked or whether they're bleeding. So I'm talking about blood vessel disease. We divide it into these two causes, brain bleeds and brain artery blockages, because they've got different causes. And tonight, what I'm talking about with a stroke, when I talk about stroke tonight, I'm talking about brain blockages, blockages to the arteries in the brain. And I'll show you some pictures about what I mean in a moment. So this is a simple picture of the brain, and it shows, it's just a cartoon, and you can see that here we have a bleed into the brain, which is caused by a damage to or a spillage over of blood, like a bruise in the brain. The strokes that I'm talking about tonight are caused by blockages in the arteries in the brain, either caused by a problem in the artery itself or caused by a clot flicking up from the heart into the brain. These blockages in the arteries occur as we accumulate thickening and narrowing in the arteries over many years, and these are caused by vascular risk factors. We're all born with arteries that look like this, completely free of any fatty plaques, and we accumulate them over the years, particularly with all the vascular risk factors I'm going to talk about in a moment. This can eventually lead to a blockage of that artery, which then causes death to the brain tissue that's supplied by that artery. So essentially it's a plumbing problem. The artery is blocked, the blood can't get through, that part of the brain is damaged or dies. The reason I'm only talking about ischemic stroke tonight, which is lack of blood supply or blockage to the brain arteries, is the risk factors are different. So for brain hemorrhages, the risk factors with some overlap are a little bit different. The big overlap is high blood pressure, and I'm going to talk more about blood pressure in a moment because it's really essential that we, as the public, really understand how critical this is. Brain hemorrhages are also associated with getting older, and they can be associated with the pathology that we see in Alzheimer's. So no doubt that they're important, it's just not tonight's topic. Strokes can occur in any part of the brain, and many of you would have family members or have suffered a stroke yourself or know people. They can occur at any part of the brain. When we think about them, we define them in a number of ways about where they affect, whether they affect the outside of the brain, the grey matter of the brain, or the white matter, the deeper structures. And we also think about what caused the stroke. Was it a blockage of a big artery in the brain or a big artery in the neck or a clot coming from the heart? Or was it caused by a very small blood vessel in the brain blocking off? The reason that's important is because the small blood vessels can cause little lakes or lacunae of damage, and it appears that these little strokes in the deep white matter of the brain are very important for our brain function down the track. And they're also important because the risk factors that underlie these two diseases are slightly different. So they're important for us clinically when we see patients on the ward. And again, this is just a cartoon showing different types of brain strokes. An infarct is the medical term for a death of tissue. You can have one in your heart, which is a myocardial infarct. You can have them in any part of your body. In the brain, they're cerebral infarcts. And these can occur by an occlusion, as I said before, of the arteries in the neck or in the big vessels in the brain, or even by an occlusion in these tiny little blood vessels that are very fine and very delicate and are particularly vulnerable to the brain, to the changes that occur with high blood pressure. This is an actual picture, a slice of the brain where the blood vessels have been filled or stained with a resin so we can see them. These are the big vessels coming up from below, that actually the extension of the neck arteries, and these are these long penetrating arteries that come up. And you can see how if these are occluded there or blocked, there's nothing that's going to save these areas around the brain. So they're very, very vulnerable and very delicate. This is just a picture that what we actually see on an MRI or a CT scan, a CAT scan. This is a little hole in the brain that has occurred following a stroke. The lines aren't there normally. That's just something that we put on when we're doing certain analyses. And this is a larger stroke. a stroke in the cortex of the brain. So this is a big stroke that's occurred in the cortex, the grey matter of the brain. They look quite different, the sites are different. Now, people can have both, and often they do, and people can accumulate strokes over their lives. Sometimes they don't know. 10% of people don't even know they've had a stroke. This is another form of brain pathology that we're really interested in now, and this is what we call white matter disease. So you see that this is the brain being sliced a normal way, so sort of through your head like this. We call these axial slices, and all this white shouldn't be here. This is not normal. And you can see that this is in the deep white matter, where those long skinny arteries were that were really vulnerable to blood pressure. And you can see that all of this damage is accumulating. It's not actually stroke or death of the tissue, but it's an area of the brain that's got reduced or compromised blood supply. And that will just be slowing down all of our thinking processes, importantly. So the risk factors for stroke, many of you will know. High blood pressure, as I've already alluded to, an irregular heart rhythm called atrial fibrillation, which is very important, smoking, diabetes, raised blood lipids like cholesterol, obesity, lack of physical exercise, and a particular genetic variation, which we all have this gene for the ApoE4, but if you have a particular genetic variation, you're more at risk of vascular disease. So these are established risk factors for stroke. We've known about these for many, many years. So tonight, when I'm talking about dementia, it's obviously something that's a very different disease process. Clinically, we use the term dementia for a progressive decline in cognitive function. Now, it is important because all of the current definitions mean that you have to be getting worse. Many people after a stroke, for example, might have problems with their memory, they might have problems with their speech, but they recover. They don't have a progressive brain problem. We only usually use the term dementia when there's actually an impact on your activities of daily living. That is, you can have a memory problem, but if you can still do your banking, your shopping and drive, it doesn't matter. But if it starts to impair your ability to get home, or you're getting lost on the train, or you can't remember your PIN, or you can't remember where the bank is, then that's when we start to think this person might have a dementia. Many, many people in the community use the term dementia to refer to Alzheimer's disease and memory loss. Alzheimer's disease is the commonest cause of dementia, but it is a dementia syndrome. It's not the only one. And you actually can have a dementia without memory problems at all, which people are often surprised by. What dementia syndromes all share is a degenerative cause. So the underlying cause is degeneration. They're actually getting reduction in their brain volume, reduction in their cognition. And we see that on brain scans as brain atrophy. You might have heard that term, and atrophy just means shrinkage of anything, but in this context it's shrinkage of the brain. So when I'm talking about brain atrophy tonight, I'm talking about loss of brain cells and shrinkage of the brain. Now, as I said, Alzheimer's disease is the commonest form of dementia, and it's certainly associated with memory loss. It's associated with quite a lot of anxiety and depression, sometimes some paranoia. Everyone's different. I run my clinics today, and each person I saw today had a different set of symptoms that they presented with, and it's characterised by decline. And on brain pathology, there are actually two types of deposits into the brain that we see in patients with Alzheimer's disease, and they're called amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Now, the terms amyloid and tau are just the names of the protein. What's important is that the amyloid hypothesis is a hypothesis that has been around for around 30 years, in which we say the amyloid deposits in the brain are causing the degeneration of the brain, and this accumulation of this protein is eventually causing cell death. The cells then die. And there's very good evidence for this. This is a cartoon of nerve cells. They don't really look like this. I'll show you later what they look like. And this is normal. They should be looking happy with little processes that extend out and having a normal interstitium or normal background. What happens in Alzheimer's is that these plaques occur, interfering with the communication between the brain cells, and that the actual nerves are filled with tangles, these tangles that are caused by this tau protein. And this is a real picture of a particular stain where we can see the amyloid plaques. This is occurring in between the cells and the actual tangles which are within the cell itself. And you can imagine that a cell full of this protein wouldn't be very happy and would probably be on the way to dying. So what are the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease? You might say that they look really familiar. Hypertension, smoking, diabetes, obesity, physical activity, this genetic variation that I mentioned before. We now know that atrial fibrillation, this irregular heartbeat, which was only thought to be a risk factor for stroke, is also a risk factor. There are certainly some genetic causes, some particular genetic mutations, and the older risk factors we used to be taught when I was at medical school, family history and head injury and years of education, there's no doubt they're important, but they're certainly not the strongest risk factors for Alzheimer's, not by a long shot. So this has made some researchers, many researchers around the world, propose this vascular hypothesis. They're not saying that amyloid and tau aren't important, they're just saying that there's more to Alzheimer's disease than just this deposition of proteins. And they've been swayed by this body of evidence saying that, gosh, the risk factors are the same, they coexist in the same populations. And we also know that these proteins, these little plaques that occur in the brain from amyloid, in community studies don't really correlate very well with your level of function, your ability to think. Now, certainly when patients are followed over a long time, we know the correlation's good, but when we look at a whole community, the correlation is quite poor. So that's proposed, the researchers have proposed this amyloid hypothesis. And there's still lots and lots of controversy and arguments about this, as there is in all good science. And one thing that's often asked by my patients is that, do strokes and Alzheimer's disease pathology in my brain, can they coexist? And the answer is yes, very, very frequently in fact. Some researchers have found that whilst only about 10% of people who have Alzheimer's disease have a history of stroke during their lifetime, more than a third of them have strokes when they actually come to post-mortem, when they die and we look at their brain under the microscope. And this has been echoed in other studies right around the world in different communities. And a study in the UK done by Raj Kalari and Ballard found that, yes, a third had strokes that we could see with the naked eye, but when they really looked under the microscope for these small vessels, these fine vessels that I showed you before, these long, fragile vessels, 100% had microvascular disease, had small vessel disease. So there's no doubt that the conditions coexist together. So it obviously raises the question whether do strokes cause dementia, and this is something that we're very interested in. In fact, my group in Melbourne, we have a research project on this. So when we looked at the literature on this, we found that up to 1 in 3 people, when they arrive on the stroke wards, can have a history of some cognitive problems. Now that's not necessarily dementia, they might just have some cognitive problems. They might have had a previous stroke, or they might have just had problems with their memory, hasn't necessarily been investigated. But we know that between 10 and 30% of people, depending on the study, actually have a dementia syndrome at 3 years. And what we've now found, and this has been quite recent and it's only been with studies such as the one that we're doing in Melbourne, is that there's some brain regions that are really susceptible, are really vulnerable to atrophy following stroke, even if the stroke doesn't affect them, doesn't even go near them. You can have a stroke in the front of your brain, but after a stroke, parts of the brain that are vulnerable seem to just be very sensitive to this insult and start to wither and die. Now, this has been really complicated because after a stroke, many of you will know, you actually get better. There's in fact competing influences. People recover following stroke. I'm on ward service right now, and everyone that I see on the ward, apart from a small handful, are going to get much better. Their language will recover, their walking will recover, they get better. So there's these competing mechanisms between this remodelling after stroke, which we often use the term plasticity, and versus a degeneration. So I think that when we think about this, think, well, Alzheimer's, dementia and stroke share the same risk factors. What we don't know is whether or not the stroke's driving a deposit of this abnormal protein, this amyloid, When we have done studies looking at this, there's actually very little evidence that there's a raised amyloid necessarily in patients who've had a single stroke. What is common is that the strokes and the amyloid are existing together. So it's very difficult to know which came first, whether it's the vascular risk factors, which are very significant, or whether it's the stroke itself. And with more and more studies that are accumulating, what it appears is that it is this small vessel disease, these little fine vessels that are accumulating damage over time that are really important. And the strongest evidence is damage to those blood vessels. So we've argued for a while, is it the association between stroke and dementia? What is it? Is it just the shared risk factors? There's a fantastic study in the States that some of you might have heard about called the Religious Orders Study, which is from the Midwest in the US. And most people refer to it as the nun study because it was actually over 1,000 women who were sisters, nuns, who had cognitive testing. They all went and had their cognitive testing done formally with a neuropsychologist. Interestingly, the level of motivation of these women was very high. They were aged between 75 and 102 on their first assessment. So I think that's optimism, that they were going to keep going. The mean age was about 83. And the plan was to follow these women. They all donated their brains. They all said, yes, you can have my brain when I die, and you can look at how I'm doing in life to what my brain looks like when I die. And they found in this study, and this was a really important study, you can see that this was back in 1997, which in science is a long time ago. And they found that the women who had strokes had poor cognitive function, had more cognitive problems during life than those that didn't. They also had there was more of an association with dementia. So there was a strong association with the strokes and the dementia on autopsy. There was no association or very little association between this amyloid deposition and what they were doing during life. So as I said, on community studies, there was a very little association. What was really important is that the dementia prevalence and the cognitive problem prevalence, so how common it was most associated with these small vessels, these fine vessels in the brain. And there have now been many studies that have replicated this around the world. There's great community longitudinal studies in the States and also in the UK and in the northern parts of Europe. They've found the same thing, that stroke confers a very significant risk of dementia, and that dementia risk correlates with the number and extent of brain disease, of stroke-related brain disease. In fact, one study said that a single stroke was significant to cause enough cognitive problems that looked like people that during life they had the same problems as someone who had moderate stage Alzheimer's disease. I think that's not always true. I think that's only one study. Because the fact is that not everyone with stroke gets dementia. By far and away, the majority of patients that we see don't. So why is that? And how do strokes cause dementia? What is actually happening? So what we need to do to understand how they're causing dementia or how they're being associated with dementia is we need to really follow patients after stroke. And so we're doing that here at the Florey, at the Austin, and we've got colleagues in Munich and in Lille who are also doing similar longitudinal studies. In fact, none of us discussed these studies together. We're now collaborating together, but it really was a bit of a case of universal consciousness that all these studies were developed at the same time. I think everyone realised that this was where we needed to go. And what we're trying to look at is what's happening to the brain following stroke, which parts of the brain are declining, are atrophying, which patients actually start to develop problems with their thinking? Is it everyone? Is it just the people with high blood pressure? Is there something specific about these people? What we have found, and this is, so I'd have to emphasise that this study is, we're just getting to the 3-year follow-up with a very small number of our patients now, so we're really in the mid-stages of the study. But we are finding that certain brain areas of the brain are really vulnerable and they wither or atrophy much faster than others. These vulnerable regions have both got medical names. They're called the hippocampi and the thalami. These are deep regions in the temporal parts of the brain that are important for memory, the hippocampi, and the thalami are really where our brain plugs into our body. It's where all of the information that's coming up in our spinal cord and our brainstem plugs into our cortex. So you can imagine how important that is for many, many, many functions. The thalami also set our brain waves. They're the things that give us our normal alpha rhythms, and they're critically important for sleep. So they're very important structures. And it's these regions that atrophy, wither, following stroke. And it's these regions that appear to be correlated with cognitive problems following stroke. So this is a very simple cartoon to show you where they are. So this is a brain, and we're looking into the brain. This is the hippocampi. It's sort of a long sausage-shaped structure that goes in the bottom of the brain, deep in the brain. I'll show you some other pictures to get an idea of where it is. And these are the thalami. So the brain stem would be coming down here, and that would be plugging into all of these regions. This little pit at the front of the brain is actually a region that gives our memories emotion. So it's very much an emotional area. So these are all very interconnected, our emotions, our memories, and our function, not surprisingly. The hippocampus is called a hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse. And I've put this up because I've never understood that. It looks to me in every other picture like a sausage. But however, there is a picture, and that's the only time I think it's ever looked like a seahorse. I was quite excited when I found that. They were very fanciful, I think, those early anatomists. This is what it looks like when we slice the brain, like imagine if a corona or a tiara that is cutting down. You can see that that's the slice of the brain down there. This is a common way that we actually image the brain on MRI scan because we want to have a look at the hippocampi, which are right down here. You can imagine that they're hard to see on many other slices. And we look at those brain regions to see if they're going to be withering or atrophying. So these very important memory regions. This is an MRI scan of someone who has had atrophy of their hippocampi. So you saw these lovely fat areas here that were full of cells and full of brain. And here they are withering away. All this black is fluid around the brain. This is where the hippocampi used to be, and they've withered. And this atrophy occurs in many diseases. It occurs in Alzheimer's disease, and it very much occurs in stroke. We've actually looked at this, and this is some old data that we published some years ago now, looking at the thickness of the grey matter, the volume or the size of the hippocampi, and the volume of the thalami, these other structures, these where the brain plugs in, over 3 months following stroke. And you can see that the thickness of the grey matter is staying around, in fact going up, probably because of the recovery that's happening after stroke. But the hippocampi are declining and the thalami are declining a lot, particularly on the side of the stroke, but on both sides. So it doesn't, it's not just the actual stroke itself that's causing damage to these regions. We've looked at, just recently, yesterday, we've looked at some of the long-term follow-up of our patients, following them out to 3 years. Now these are very small numbers, I would hasten to add. And you can see that the brain, this is the hippocampal volume, those memory structures in that sausage-shaped or seahorse-shaped area, and you can see that it is declining over the years, over the 3 years, particularly in the time between 1 year and 3 years, and that the whole brain volume is also declining as well. Now, brain atrophy, sadly, is a natural process. All of our brains are atrophying after the age of around 25. However, we know that this process is accelerated in stroke. So, I can imagine you're all feeling fairly despondent now, and it has been a pretty grim talk up until now. So usually I used to end my talks then, and then I'd have a sea of hands go up and say, well, what can I do about this? So I'm going to talk about that. What can we do to prevent this from happening to me? So I was thinking about this over the weekend, and I think you should get checked, you should get lean, and you should get fit. That's what you need to do. When I say get checked for what? And the most important public health message I could give tonight is go and get your blood pressure checked. It is critical. If you saw those little tiny blood vessels that are really vulnerable, and we know that they're associated with, most strongly associated with your brain, your cognition following stroke, they're the ones that just are getting, really damaged by high blood pressure. The brain is the most vulnerable end organ for high blood pressure. We think of blood pressure and the heart, and that's true, but 1/5 of every heartbeat goes to our brain, even though it's only 5% of our body weight. It's such a vascular organ. 1/5 of every heartbeat should go to our brain. And it's the most highly vascular organ in the whole body. When we think of high blood pressure, people say, oh, that's only my heart, but in fact only 16% of heart risk is attributable to hypertension, whereas 1/3 of stroke risk is attributable to hypertension. It is the most important risk factor, and there's no doubt that it's a leading cause of cognitive impairment. So when I see people now and they say they can't be bothered taking their blood pressure medications, I tell them this. And it's funny because I can say to people, you might have a stroke, and they're like, yeah, you might have a heart attack, well, you might get dementia, and they always look up. And again, just to emphasise, it is these little blood vessels, these tiny little blood vessels that are being destroyed. There's nothing else that's supplying these brain areas, this white matter, which is all of the connections of our brain. The outside of our brain is the grey matter, and it's where the nerve cells are, but they have to talk to other regions in the brain. If they're getting damaged by if the white matter is not getting blood, then it's not working, and it can't talk to other parts of the brain. We know that it's not late life hypertension, it's midlife risk factors that are the most important. So people always, often if I see people in their 40s and they've got high blood pressure, they'll say, oh, I'll leave it for a while. But that's critical. Midlife starts at 35, sadly, and midlife vascular risk factors are recognised as the most important risk for Alzheimer's disease. And we know that if you've got bad blood pressure, we can actually see on very fine testing some cognitive changes after only a couple of years. So it is critical. Midlife, not late life, high blood pressure is the strongest risk. In fact, late life hypertension probably doesn't matter so much to the brain. There's very little evidence that if you get high blood pressure in your 80s, that it's going to really be associated. But if you've had it all your life, then that matters. So get checked. Structural brain ageing, these strokes and these white matter disease are really strongly associated. And the other thing that's associated is loss of brain tissue in these hippocampi, again, in parts of the grey matter of the disease. And we know that people can have very severe shrinkage and atrophy of the hippocampi, even if if they've got a long history of hypertension at the time they present with their first stroke. So the damage is going on at the time. So when I say get checked, I mean get checked for diabetes too, and for cholesterol, but cholesterol certainly isn't as strong a risk factor for our brain as hypertension and diabetes. We know that people who have type 2 diabetes, which is the term that we now use, people often think of that as adult onset or older age diabetes, not juvenile diabetes that kids get. It's the diabetes that we usually see in association with being too fat or being too sedentary, although there's no doubt that some of us have a predisposition to diabetes when we get older. We know that people who are older than 70, who've had a history of this type 2 diabetes, have got twice the likelihood of developing cognitive problems. We know that diabetes doubles the risk of Alzheimer's disease. It trebles the risk of problems, of dementia problems in people so it trebles the severity, if you like, of Alzheimer's disease if they've had stroke. And a fantastic longitudinal study called the Honolulu Asian Aging Study really correlated the association between midlife diabetes, stroke and Alzheimer's disease. So get checked for diabetes as well. The next thing that I said is get lean, and obesity and dementia is a really hot topic right now. It's only been in the last 5 years, I think the first study was about 10 years ago, that correlated or associated your body weight, and particularly your body mass index. That's an index that we use to calculate how tall you are, how much you weigh, and what you should be. And there's a wide range that we should all be in. We know that being high or being overweight with a high BMI is strongly associated with your brain volume and with your cognition. Again, if you live to 80 and you're fine and you suddenly decide that you're going to eat chocolates every day and you get fat with that, it doesn't seem to matter. So there is hope, I think. We can, lash out when we hit 80. People with higher body mass indices have got lower whole brain volume. They can have lower regions. These are all obviously on studies done on people who've had their brain image. What's important, and I think what's really interesting, is that the same regions that actually get bolstered and protected by exercise in the brain, which are the hippocampi and certain other regions in the brain, are actually going down with obesity. So there's a really strong association or strong interaction between our body mass index, our level of activity, and our weight. It's very interesting. And for many researchers, they've introduced this concept of a neuroprotective lifestyle, which is, eating well, sleeping well, getting lean, getting fit. And I think that we can all take some lessons from that. And the last thing I said was to get fit. And there's no doubt that exercise and dementia are really important. And this is the only risk factor, if you like, that's a good risk factor. It actually reduces your risk of developing dementia and cognitive problems. Physical activity so higher levels of physical activity are associated with higher brain volume and less risk of dementia. Lower levels of physical activity, lifelong, are associated with lower brain volumes and more dementia. That's the story, basically. There was a nice study that came out this year that showed that the fitter you are in terms of your cardiorespiratory fitness, your ability to run aerobically, was associated with thickening or increase in certain areas of the brain, the areas of the brain that often atrophy, so really important areas. So you can actually put on cortex, you can put on brain. It was also associated with less of those white matter lesions that I showed you before, that low blood supply related risk. It was associated with better cognitive performance and better mood. And I haven't spoken about this tonight, but certainly there's no doubt that dementia and depression are associated, particularly in later life. They've found that if you habitually, so it can't just be one run once a year, it's if you habitually participate in physical activity, and this was 3 to 5 times per week, it actually might provide protection for brain structure and cognitive function, decreasing your risk for Alzheimer's. So this whole concept, again, of a neuroprotective lifestyle. Now, I should add that I went to a really fantastic lecture a couple of years ago on a man who was essentially curing some people with very early Parkinson's disease with very extensive exercise. And he went and did a study of hunter-gatherer societies and found that they, on average, walked or ran, and they ran a lot, between 11 and 19 kilometres every day. Every single day. So that's what we evolved to do, that's what we were born to do, And in some studies, the average American walks or doesn't run at all 300 metres. So that would be getting up, walking to the shower and the toilet, walking to the car, driving, walking into your workplace, walking back to the car, walking back home, walking back into the house. And that would be it. We weren't born to be so sedentary. We were born and evolved to be incredibly active. So the Finns seem to be really interested in this, all the Northern Europeans, and there's been a lot of studies looking at the association with physical activity and dementia. And we know that, again, this midlife story comes back again. We know that low levels of midlife physical activity, especially if you keep going until you're older, are associated, especially if you don't keep going, so you stay sedentary, you start sedentary, you stay sedentary, then you're going to have a higher risk of dementia. And the risk is most increased in these people have that genetic variation, but it was across the board. And these were big studies, 20,000 people. That's a big study in medicine, that they found that if you had higher midlife fitness, so you were fit, you stayed fit and you were higher in your 30s and 40s and 50s, that your risk of developing any type of dementia was greatly reduced. So a much lower risk of dementia in later life, independent of whether you develop strokes or not. So I just thought I'd inspire you with these two little vignettes. This is Ed. He just did a sub 4-hour marathon last year at the age of 82, which I know that that's not what, most people would do, but I certainly couldn't do that. And this is Harriet, who did her 15th marathon this year at the age of 91, and she took 7 hours, but still, she did it. So I think it's never too late. I often have patients say, I'm 80 and I can't do that. Well, that's just not true. So, but we should all be starting. We should be starting from birth, but we should be really hitting it hard from our 30s and 40s, no doubt about it. So, my response is move and move and move. So tonight I wanted to just present an overview, and I did want to allow time for discussion and questions if you have any, to say that stroke and dementia are linked, and we still are looking and trying to find exactly how they're causing each other, if you like. We know there's a strong association between the risk factors. We now know, and this is quite recent, that there's a very strong association between the stroke and then atrophy or shrinkage of these very vulnerable brain areas. We don't know why in particular these areas are vulnerable. It's probably because they're so connected and they're so important for so many functions. We know that vascular risk prevention is absolutely critical. Treatment is critical, so that's a really important thing. So my summary is get checked for blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, get lean as you can be. Get fit, get connected socially is really important. There's no doubt that social isolation is associated with increased risk of heart disease and stroke and dementia. Get happy, because depression's associated as well. And get active in research, because the more we understand about these conditions, the more we can actually do to prevent them. So I always say to people, if you've got money, donate money. If you've got time, donate time by giving, by either participating in research or getting involved. Some patients say, well, I don't have time or money, what can I do? And I say, well, you can donate your brain. And we do Brain Bank, and you can do that if you're interested. So there's many, many ways you can get involved in research. And we always, we're all scientists are starving artists. We're all in a parlous financial situation. So, thank you all for your attention. I just want to acknowledge we're very lucky with the Sid and Fiona Meyer Foundation, the NHMRC and the Collie Trust, as well as the VLSCI have participated and helped us with our research. And Amanda just wanted to let you know that if you want to stay connected and involved with the Florey, there's a little flyer at the back that you can pull out and fill out and leave here for her. Thank you. This lady said that her husband had what was thought to be 3 small brain clots when they were abroad on holidays, and when she came back she was told that it was just a migraine. And what does that mean? Is that something that we can see? And yes, it is. However, there's no doubt that they're very different conditions. They can look a bit the same, but migraine doesn't cause dementia. There was someone back there. Now, if I can't see you, wave your hand. The lights in here are quite hard, so I might not see you. Yes, the man in the check shirt.
Dr. Brodtmann, can we draw any conclusions from your research for traumatic brain injury?
Did everyone hear that? The question was whether or not there's any conclusions for traumatic brain injury. Yes and no. I think that there is very good evidence that traumatic brain injury, so that's when we have an injury to the brain, it's a term used for everything. So if you have a brain bleed from an aneurysm, that's a traumatic brain injury as well. There's very good evidence that protein tau that fills up the brain cells in Alzheimer's, the levels go up in traumatic brain injury, and that may be leading to an ongoing degeneration down the track. We aren't doing tau imaging in our research, though we may at some stage do it in the future. So I think that that's where the association may be. The question was whether or not the amyloid and the tau are from the brain or from somewhere else and come up. They are in the brain. Tau is very widely distributed. We can get tau in many, many organs. The very peculiar thing about the brain is that it's very protected. It's got this blood-brain barrier that's very, very functional, and it stops to keep all bad things out. But that means the brain has to do all of its work. It has to clean itself. It has to do all of the maintenance work, if you like. But certainly certainly the amyloid hypothesis says that it's an overproduction or a lack of clearance of this protein that is causing the accumulation. And the same is true of tau. But yes, the evidence that we have is that they're accumulating in the brain themselves. There's actually a lot of different proteins that can accumulate in the brain, causing different sorts of diseases. And I think that's a function of the fact that the brain's a bit of a closed circuit for its maintenance. Yes, so the question was whether I can speak a bit about brain plasticity. So that's something that we've, obviously been really interested in the last several decades. Did you mean plasticity following stroke or brain plasticity generally? So brain plasticity following stroke is quite remarkable. All of our brains are plastic. We're born with incredibly plastic brains, and in fact children can have a childhood stroke that essentially means that half of their brain, and I mean that, half of their brain is damaged, and they can develop almost normally. They might just have a slightly smaller leg and a slight bit more of a limp on that side. So children's brains are incredibly plastic. We maintain plasticity, but it does decline as we get older, and it may be because we're developing, we're accumulating toxic proteins, or we're actually starting to develop degeneration. So there's no doubt that after stroke, people recover enormously. The processes underlying plasticity are fascinating and very complex. But there's very good evidence just broadly that other parts of the brain can pick up the functions. So a part of the brain that we might just use for a really complex task in our hand, we can recruit just for a simple thing like tapping a finger. And the other thing that's really fascinating about plasticity of the stroke is that the other side of the brain can actually pick up the slack, if you like, and we can actually get recruitment or use of the other side of the brain. Because as many of you know, one side of the brain does one side of the body, and it's 90 to 95% of those cells. So if I'm using my right hand, there's a small part of the left side of my brain that is dictating that, and the right side of my brain is essentially doing nothing. It needs to be challenged, and when we challenge it, when we look at it, and when we can scan people with a special brain imaging, functional magnetic resonance imaging, functional MRI, we can see that the brain regions that are being activated in a person after stroke, just doing a very simple task, tapping a finger, look like the same brain regions that have been activated in someone doing really complicated things with their hands. So we use those regions when we're doing something that's big and effortful normally. Children, you can actually watch if they're learning to do a task. Writing, a child when they're learning to write will wriggle and squirm and make a face, their whole body's activating, and then we become very automatic. And the same thing's happening in our brain, and we have to relearn that automaticity. So the question was, is there a correlation between Parkinson's disease and dementia? And 20 years ago, or even maybe a bit longer, 40 years ago, we would have said no, but that's not true. It certainly is. So Parkinson's disease is caused by a degeneration of different brain region than we're speaking about tonight, and a deposition of a different protein as well, but that also accumulates in the brain. Yes, people with Parkinson's disease do develop cognitive problems. There's no doubt that people with Parkinson's disease also have vascular disease as well, and in fact some people with Parkinson's disease, it's caused by vascular disease. But yes, the studies vary, but around 20 to 30% of people with Parkinson's disease get quite significant cognitive problem later in life. Yes?
Do any of these longitudinal studies pick up stroke in younger people and then correlate that with dementia later on, or is it all done in an elderly population?
So the question was whether or not we are looking at stroke in younger people and following them, or whether it's just an older population. We actually have, so anyone over the age of 18 can be involved in this study, and we do have some younger people. Strokes can occur in people, in childhood stroke there's a peak, and then it can occur any time in your life. We do see people on the ward, they're 20s, 30s and 40s. They've often got another problem, sometimes something with their heart or sometimes something in their lungs or sometimes just bad luck. The evidence is less, and it's probably because a lot of it is this overlap with the risk factors. And these people, the things that cause childhood and younger stroke are not degenerative vascular disease. They're actually sometimes an artery in the blood in the neck that becomes damaged and blocks off. Sometimes it can be from a funny blood vessel in the lungs that flicks off a clot, or from a hole in the heart. So the mechanisms for young stroke are very different than the mechanisms for the majority of stroke that we see. So yes, we're including them, but there's much less evidence for that. So I usually, when I do see younger people, I do reassure them that there's less evidence for that. So the question was whether or not collateral blood vessels, so extra blood vessels or extra connections between the blood vessels, occur in the brain with exercise. The brain's already a profoundly vascular organ, so it has extensive collateral supply, but it really is that collateral supply, as I just showed you before, if I go back to that picture, it's really on the outside of the brain. The collateral supply is on the outside. We've got a design flaw. We don't have any good collateral supply getting into the deep parts of the brain, and that's just because our blood comes from here and we've got skull around and we can't get it. There is some small evidence that small blood vessels, that the microvasculature increases with increasing activity of the actual nerves. However, it doesn't appear that that's so important with the exercise. It looks like exercise strengthens connections. It's very important for physiology, so it actually makes the blood supply more efficient. The brain is an incredibly efficient organ when it comes to we actually get an oversupply of blood when we're using a particular part of the brain, and we harness that for some imaging tasks. So no, the collateral supply is not so important in the brain. It actually looks like it's more the efficiency of the blood supply and the increase in the connections between the brain cells and the brain cells themselves. There is some evidence that exercise actually encourages new brain cell growth. This region, the hippocampi, these regions that I showed you before, those seahorses or sausages, do develop the capacity or retain the capacity to have neurogenesis until late in life, the ability to generate new nerve cells. I always think of this when I go for a run, that I'm thinking I'm generating new brain cells in my brain. And it may be that that's the reason why they're so vulnerable to these risk factors, and that may be the reason why exercise is so critical in these regions. So the question was whether or not if someone was immobilised and was unable to move themselves, would passive movement help them? Would passive movement help with their brain cells? The answer is no. The answer is that certainly passive movement is critical in people following stroke. The stimulation, the actual tactile stimulation, would be very important in getting him or her to feel what you're doing and maybe to start focusing. But it's very important in keeping the range of motion. You may have seen some people after stroke, they get stiff muscles and they develop a small range of motion, freezes their joints. So there's passive movements are very important for that. But what matters is it has to be coming from the brain. You have to be trying to do it yourself. And it's tragically one thing that we do see after very severe strokes. People can't communicate and they can't interact with us, and they lose the ability to participate in rehabilitation. And unfortunately, the evidence is that if you can't participate, if you can't actually get in and try, rehab just doesn't work. The question was that there's no doubt the physical activity the brain gets a spin-off, that is there particular mental activities that we should be doing? So the answer is get engaged, do everything. Learn a new language, and if you know one language, learn another language. You know, learn something new, be socially engaged, develop a new hobby, a new interest. Stay challenged and stay interested. I know that luminosity is huge at the moment, and in fact in the ABC program last night, they did say, well, you know, probably doesn't really help if you're sitting at home just doing it on your own. And I think that's because what they've found is that when people go and do a brain activity in a research setting, they get benefit. They get better at the task. They don't get better at anything else, but they get better at that task. And they get better overall, and they feel sharper, they feel better. They actually, if they don't do the task, they still feel better because they're actually going and getting active and getting engaged and getting out and getting social. So in fact, we are social creatures, we're herd animals. We need to be socially engaged. We shouldn't be in our little cloisters and doing nothing. So I have patients with a particular type of dementia who are very, very severely demented, who can do Sudokus in 2 seconds, 10 seconds, brilliantly, no problem at all. I couldn't do one. I'm not demented, I know that, I think I know that, and I know that they are. I think I know that too. So I think that there's a lot of stuff about brain activity, and I think a lot of people think it's easy, or I can hop on the computer and do X. It's just not the case.
At least really to another question, decline in cognitive function. Could you give some examples of that decline?
Yes, many. So there's decline in cognitive functions in many different domains. So in memory, it's obvious, we can't remember things from day to day, and that's not just where you forgot your keys or, you know, where you put your sunglasses or your glasses, because we all do that. That's just attention. It's actually having had a conversation from the day before, and even with prompting, you know, I said that to you and we're talking about this, and it gives them the context, they've got no recollection. So that's a significant sign. Or people who get lost if they can't find their way home at all in a familiar route. There are thousands, so I won't, but there are many, many signs. Yes, you can. So the question was, can you reduce or negate the genetic risk? So I would say that there's 2 types of genetic risk. There's that genetic variation, which is just a variation, which is in that ApoE4. And there's absolutely no doubt that the people who benefit the most from all of this neuroprotective lifestyle are those people. Again, the study, it's not very common, so it's a rarer cause, but they have now done some work on people who have the genetic mutations or genetic risks that would give you a very high risk of stroke or very high risk of Alzheimer's disease. And there is evidence that, again, being very active and having, you know, a very good lifestyle reduces their risk as well. The question is that when people who go who run dementia clinics or cognitive disorders clinics, we obviously want to diagnose people with a disease or a syndrome, and whether or not it was now really as clear. We used to say, oh, that person has vascular dementia and that person has Alzheimer's dementia. No, I think that they're very, very blurred. And it's a real problem because in the studies that we do, when we recruit people for, oh, you've got to have this disease, they have to fit into a certain box. And the problem is that people are, you know, we haven't been reading those books, and we haven't necessarily fit into that box. So yes, they're very, very, very mixed. And I mean, obviously this is something I have an interest in the clinic that I run. We talk about this all the time. And a person I saw just today was a classic. He presented with these he was disinhibited and quite frontal and was making bad decisions and has this very profound risk. But he also had terrible shrunken little hippocampi, those regions, and he had a memory problem that looked a bit midway between an Alzheimer's and a vascular. So there's certain memory problem that neuropsychologically we classically say. So without getting into details, yes. So the question was if this lady's father had had a stroke and he's been moved into a geriatric facility for assessment, and he's become much more confused and his memory's much worse. And is that something that's going to be a permanent problem? And has damage been done? Well, damage hasn't been done. The damage has been happening for a long, long time. So I think that, no, you haven't caused him to have brain damage by moving him to the geriatric facility. In general, they don't do that. They're nice to people. But there's no doubt that we get a lot of information from our familiar environment. You know, most of us could walk to the toilet at night with our eyes closed. I need coffee in the morning. I walk around my house with my eyes closed for the first half an hour in the morning because I can't open them until I've had my coffee. I think I make my coffee with my eyes closed. So I think that we're very familiar, and there's a lot of learnt information, we call it procedural knowledge or procedural information, procedural memory, that we discount, we forget about that. But if we're in a new environment, that we have to relearn everything, you don't know where the toilet is, it looks weird, you're not quite sure what the toilet looks like, I might go and pee in the sink rather than in the toilet. So there's all sorts of things. So no damage has been done, but I think what you've really done is perhaps unmasked his real level of function. So the question was what's the link between depression and dementia, and does treatment help? So we don't know, so I'll answer the second part first. We don't know if treatment helps, but there are actually a series of studies that are just coming out now. So there's been a couple in neurology recently, which is one of the peak journals, and in brain as well. So a few studies that are coming out looking at treatment. It's very difficult because it's hard to pull out lifelong risk of depression, whether or not you had 2 years of depression when you're in your 20s and you're now 70, whether you're depressed right now. So depression, if you're older, can look just like a dementia. So we actually call it a pseudo-dementia, and we treat them and they get better, but they never had a dementia. They just looked like it. So that is a different thing. There is some evidence that depression and it causes dementia, but again, it comes back down, interestingly, to this vascular risk. There's very good evidence that vascular disease being laid down may be causing depression in older people and therefore is associated with the dementia. And again, there's some lovely articles that have just come out recently. So is there any evidence that that carer burden in people, the carers who look after people who have had strokes or people who have Alzheimer's and the stresses that are associated with that, are they associated with an increased risk of stroke or an increased risk of dementia? Both. Yes. So, but it's not as strong. There is evidence that carer burden is enormous. The Stroke and the Alzheimer's Association in America calculated that it's something like across the world it would be worth about $220 billion if we paid our carers to do what they're doing for people with Alzheimer's and stroke. So carer burden's huge. It certainly increases stress levels. Stress doesn't cause stroke, doesn't cause dementia, doesn't cause heart disease, so there you go. So just being under pressure doesn't do it. There is evidence that carer burden is associated perhaps with an increased risk of vascular disease. However, a lot of that is carers are often not looking after themselves as well, so they're not eating as they should be, sleeping as they should be, exercising as they should be. So it's still controversial, but there is some evidence that yes, the burden of being a carer can increase your risk of some diseases and change your brain. So it's a very good reason that we should be caring for carers. All right, with that, I think I might close. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.